Vámonos directamente a esa rueda de prensa entre Antony Blinken y Jens Stoltenberg.
For Kharkiv, for Kherson, his military is suffering staggering losses on the battlefield. And he's failed to weaken our alliance and what it stands for. In fact, that alliance, NATO, is stronger and more united than it's ever been. Today, we focused on steps that we can take to ensure that Ukraine has the security assistance that it needs to defend its territory against Russian aggression. And we'll continue that conversation this afternoon when we're joined by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, here at the State Department. We've calibrated our assistance to meet Ukraine's changing needs from the outset of the Russian invasion, and that's exactly what we'll continue to do. 2 weeks ago, President Biden announced that the United States would send Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Germany committed to send its Leopard tanks and authorize other partners to do the same. This followed the earlier announcement by the United Kingdom that it would be sending Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine's defenders. Last week, we also announced 2 new assistance packages, which will provide critical air defense and counter-drone capabilities to help Ukraine defend its people, including against the threat posed by UAVs supplied by Iran, which shares Russia's authoritarian vision and is increasingly aiding and abetting its aggression. We're also providing armored infantry vehicles and more of the equipment that Ukraine is using so effectively, like Javelin anti-tank missiles, artillery ammunition, and rockets for U.S.-provided HIMARS. In total, the United States has committed nearly $30 billion since the beginning of Russia's invasion, and our allies and partners have provided more than $13 billion in military assistance over the past year, and tens of billions more in humanitarian and economic support. The contributions that Europe writ large has made to this effort are very significant and making a profound difference. As President Zelensky has said, diplomacy is the only way to definitively end Russia's war of aggression and to create a path to peace that is both just and durable. Clearly, President Putin has no genuine interest in diplomacy right now. Here's what he said just a few weeks ago. Unless and until Ukraine accepts the new territorial realities, in quotation marks, there is nothing to even talk about. In other words, Ukraine and the world must somehow acquiesce to President Putin's land grab.
Putin no está interesado realmente en la paz y de momento lo que estamos viendo allí es una intención simplemente de seguir arrebatando vidas y de extenderse en Ucrania. Palabras del secretario de Estado norteamericano junto al secretario general de la OTAN. Palabras duras y que contrastan con lo que se viene diciendo desde el Ministerio, entre otras cosas, de Exteriores ruso, donde Sergei Lavrov ha dicho ya en varias ocasiones que, por su parte, en realidad lo que hay es un intento de alcanzar la paz, un entendimiento entre unas cosas y otras, pero que Estados Unidos pues no se está sentando. Unos y otros en esa diatriba, de momento Blinken explicando que además, ojo, vamos a ello, Pekín acaba de decir ha violado el espacio aéreo norteamericano desde la semana pasada. Vamos a ver exactamente qué dice Blinken.
To protect our interests. There is an ongoing operation to recover the balloon's components. We're analyzing them to learn more about the surveillance program. We'll pair that with what we learned from the balloon itself, with what we gleaned based on our careful observation of the system when it was in our airspace, as the President directed his team to do. We'll also share relevant findings with Congress as well as with our allies and partners around the world. Senior administration officials are on the Hill this week, and we already shared information with dozens of countries around the world, both from Washington and through our embassies. We're doing so because the United States was not the only target of this broader program, which has violated the sovereignty of countries across 5 continents. In our engagements, we are again hearing from our partners that the world expects China and the United States to manage our relationship responsibly. That's precisely what we set out to do. We continue to urge China to do the same. We're also continuing to strengthen and broaden NATO's partnerships and weave them together in new ways. The United States welcomed the Secretary General's visit to South Korea and Japan last week as an extension of those efforts, demonstrating the growing synergy between our Atlantic and Pacific alliances. And of course, we're very focused on the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. These countries are ready to bring their strengths to bear on our alliance.
Importante esto que está diciendo. Reitera las palabras de Karine Jean-Pierre, de la portavoz de la Casa Blanca, diciendo que se han visto estos globos satelitales de China en los 5 continentes, que así se lo han explicado sus distintos socios y que ellos están reafirmando una y otra vez la alianza, el acuerdo que tienen tanto con la OTAN como con el resto de aliados. Y también importante este matiz que ha dado, hablando de cómo tanto desde la OTAN como ellos mismos están impulsando las relaciones con Japón o con Corea del Sur, en lo que claramente es algo que el propio Blinken sabe que puede estar en ese sentido molestando a China en tanto a las bases que tienen en los alrededores, como especialmente la relación que Estados Unidos mantiene con Taiwán. Es por eso, o trata de dejar caer Blinken por eso, por esa razón, que los globos satelitales de China estaban sobrevolando los continentes, porque están vigilando qué puede ocurrir con esto que consideran parte de esa política de una sola China en Taiwán. Vamos otra vez hasta Washington, vamos hasta esa rueda de prensa. Va a comenzar a hablar Jens Stoltenberg, secretario general de la OTAN.
I would like to start by commending President Biden and the United States for providing such strong leadership at a time when we face the most serious security crisis in a generation. And thank you, Tony, for your personal commitment and your leadership on every issue related to NATO and the vital bond between America and Europe. Unwavering American leadership and bipartisan support have ensured that NATO allies are united like never before. And our unity makes a real difference. President Putin launched his illegal war of aggression almost a year ago. Since then, NATO allies have provided unprecedented support for Ukraine. Around $120 billion in military, humanitarian and financial assistance. As the biggest ally, the United States is playing an indispensable role in supporting Ukraine. European NATO allies and Canada have stepped up as well, contributing over half of the overall assistance, including tanks, advanced air defense systems and other military equipment. Europeans have also welcomed almost 5 million refugees from Ukraine, applied unprecedented sanctions and decoupled from Russian gas and Russian oil. This shows how much we can do when Europe and North America stand together. Today we discussed the situation in Ukraine. Putin started this war of aggression, and he can end this war today by withdrawing his troops from Ukraine and coming to the negotiating table.
Pues ahí están algunas de las palabras. Putin empezó esta guerra hace casi un año y tiene la posibilidad de frenar esta guerra retirando a sus tropas y sentándose en la mesa de negociación. Palabras de un Jens Stoltenberg, secretario general de la OTAN, que lo primero que ha hecho es recordar la ayuda de más de 120.000 millones de dólares que le han dado los aliados, Estados Unidos incluido. De hecho, ha agradecido especialmente, que es curioso también, y no sorprendente, el secretario general de la OTAN a Estados Unidos su participación en toda esa ayuda que ha recibido Ucrania, porque ha sido de los que más se ha volcado. También lo ha hecho, ha dicho, los aliados europeos, Reino Unido, Canadá, en fin. Agradece Stoltenberg toda esta colaboración en material, en ayuda humanitaria y en dinero para que se realicen ciertas compras. Insisto, más de 120.000 millones al margen de esa parte de los escudos antimisiles, de los misiles de largo alcance, de los drones o de los tanques, los famosos tanques Leopard o los Abrams, si es que terminan estos últimos llegando a tierras ucranianas. La culpa es de Putin, si quiere la paz, dice Jens Stoltenberg, que retira sus tropas y se siente a negociar. Volvemos hasta allí.
So what happens in Europe today could happen in Asia tomorrow. China is substantially building up its military forces, including nuclear weapons without any transparency. It is attempting to assert control over the South China Sea and threatening Taiwan, trying to take control of critical infrastructure, including in NATO countries, repressing its own citizens and trampling on human rights, and deepening its strategic partnership with Moscow. So NATO allies have real concerns, which we discussed today. In this more dangerous and more competitive world, we must continue to strengthen our deterrence and defense, and further increase defense spending. And that is what we are doing. In 2014,
hay que incrementar el gasto en defensa y eso es lo que estamos haciendo. todo un secretario general de la OTAN dando instrucciones de lo que puede ocurrir y de lo que debe ocurrir. Ha hablado de esos 120.000 millones ya gastados, ya dados en ayuda, ya sea humanitaria, económica directa o militar a Ucrania e insiste, hay que seguir incrementando ese gasto en defensa. Por cierto, un Jens Stoltenberg, que ya saben, y esto simplemente a modo de apunte, que suena de pronto para acabar de director gerente del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Volvemos hasta Washington a ver exactamente qué sigue diciendo Stoltenberg y, sobre todo, qué hay en esa rueda de preguntas más allá de esos discursos escritos.
At the Madrid summit last July, all allies made a historic decision to invite both countries to join NATO. All allies have signed the accession protocols, and 28 allies have already ratified the agreement. Finland and Sweden are now being integrated into the civilian and military structures of our alliance. This has already strengthened their security, and it is inconceivable that allies would not act should Finland or Sweden come under pressure.
Ojo a esto último, es importante e inconcebible que los aliados, que la OTAN, que Europa no actúe si Finlandia o Suecia se sienten presionados por la situación de lo que está ocurriendo en Ucrania, por la situación que está generando Rusia. Inconcebible que no se entrase a ayudar a Suecia o a Finlandia dentro de esa presión. Ojo, porque claramente Jens Stoltenberg está elevando el tono. Vamos, que creo que comienza ya esa rueda de prensa, a ver qué preguntan y, sobre todo, a ver qué responden.
Hi there, Mr. Secretary and Secretary General. Thanks for doing this. Mr. Secretary, you started the press conference speaking about the tragic earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and actually that's my question is relevant to that. Specifically, as you know, there's one border crossing in the northwest of Syria, which is damaged by the earthquake, and there are no other crossings, and so obviously it's going to be difficult to get the aid there. And you also said that you were adamant in saying that all U.S. aid would go through local NGOs, U.S.-funded local NGOs. And so my question is this, I was wondering if the administration has had any contact at any level with the Syrian government, and if there were a request through the Syrian government, would the U.S. the administration accede to that request to coordinate aid for the Syrian people? And a question for the Secretary General, since Turkey is obviously a NATO member, could you provide us some detail on what NATO is actually doing?
Pregunta para Antony Blinken sobre lo ocurrido en Siria, con esa parte de los terremotos, si se va a dar alguna ayuda, si la administración norteamericana está en contacto con Siria. Pregunta para el secretario general de la OTAN, para Jens Stoltenberg, si con lo ocurrido en Ucrania, miembro además, se va también a intentar relajar la tensión que existía previamente por la relación entre Turquía y Rusia con la propia OTAN, y si se va también a trasladar alguna ayuda. Volvemos hasta allí.
United States government and the Syrian government in recent days since the earthquake. But here's what we've been doing. If you go back to 2011, we provided more than $15 billion in assistance to the Syrian people through NGO partners, international NGO partners, partners on the ground in Syria. We're a leading provider of humanitarian assistance to Syria, to the Syrian people, not to the government. And working through these partners, we've tried to make sure that the assistance gets to where it's needed. And that's the people who are affected by the horrific war that Assad has waged on his own people since 2011. And now, in the case of the earthquake, to people affected by the earthquake. You're exactly right that there is one crossing that allows assistance to get into Syria from the outside, and that was disrupted by the earthquake. It's exactly why we have been fighting every single year, not only to preserve that crossing, it's authorized, as you know, by the United Nations, but to get additional ones so that if a crossing was taken out of action, there would be other places that people could get humanitarian assistance in. And of course, year after year, Russia has sought to block those crossings or to limit them. And that only compounds the tragedy that people in Syria are now experiencing.
Just a couple of hours after the earthquake, we sent out a call from the NATO headquarters to all NATO allies to provide immediate support.
Ya vamos con la respuesta de Stoltenberg. A modo de resumen y rápidamente, Blinken asegura que efectivamente se sigue velando por ciertos bordes, por defender ciertas fronteras en Siria, pero que ya se está dando mucha ayuda. Se continúa en esa línea en la que ya iba el gobierno estadounidense. Vamos a ver qué dice sobre el tema de Turquía el propio Stoltenberg desde la Secretaría General de la OTAN.
Are stepping up, and that's the continued message from NATO, is that we should support Turkey, a valued and important NATO ally, where we see human suffering and the devastating consequences of the earthquake. And of course, allies have also expressed their deepest condolences, it is heartbreaking to see all the suffering, but also to see how people and allies are now stepping up to provide as much help as possible.
Tova Virogas, NRK.
Question for Secretary Blinken. How important is it for the Biden administration that Sweden is also allowed to join NATO, not just Finland?
Bueno, sobre Turquía no ha sido especialmente, lamenta lo ocurrido, la relación dice es buena, hay cierta tensión, hay que evaluar, hay que ver, hay que esperar. De momento vamos a ver si inciden un poco más porque de algún detalle más, pero de momento poco que decir al respecto. Vamos a ver porque le preguntan justo por el asunto de Suecia y lo que está ocurriendo con esas presiones que reciben.
This is an alliance matter, and our view is very clear. Both Finland and Sweden are ready to be NATO allies, and the alliance should welcome them as quickly as possible. Their militaries already work seamlessly with alliance forces. As I said earlier, they're strong, vibrant democracies. We're confident that NATO will formally welcome both countries and that will happen soon. And this will, in turn, enhance security across the entire Euro-Atlantic region. As this process continues, we are fully committed to Finland and Sweden's accession to the alliance. And again, I think you can see the strength of that support across the alliance. Nearly all countries took swift action. Our Senate overwhelmingly and on a bipartisan basis voted for their membership, and the time is right now to finalize that accession process and to welcome them as full members of NATO. We support the work that both countries have been doing with Turkey to address legitimate concerns that Turkey has brought to the table about its security. There's an ongoing process there, but as you know, both countries, Finland and Sweden, took significant steps to address concerns that Turkey raised. They made commitments under a memorandum of agreement that was signed in Madrid, and they are making good on the commitments that they've made. Again, we acknowledge Turkey's long-time security concerns. We appreciate the tangible actions that both countries, Finland and Sweden, have taken to address them.
Nick Schifrin of PBS.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, forgive me, two questions.
Antony Blinken, sobre si Finlandia o Suecia deben entrar en la OTAN, son claramente, dice, aliados de la OTAN. Las tensiones que se están viviendo para con Turquía sobre si entran o no es algo que se puede dirimir y que están dando buenos pasos, que están cumpliendo con todo lo que se les requiere y que desde luego están en la muy buena línea para formar parte de esa OTAN. O sea, importante ese paso porque efectivamente se protegería y mucho a Suecia. También ha hablado de que militarmente siempre van a estar de ese lado de Suecia y de Finlandia, pero se protegería y mucho a Suecia y a Finlandia de lo que pudiera ocurrir si es que existe realmente una capacidad de contagio que llegue hasta tan alto, ¿no? Pero, desde luego, esto está sobre la mesa, es un asunto de esas claves geopolíticas y en eso están hablando. Le preguntan ahora por lo que está ocurriendo con China, con esos globos satelitales y con la relación con Xi Jinping. A ambos, tanto a Blinken como a Jens Stoltenberg, a quien le preguntan también qué es lo que piensa de esos globos que se han visto de China en distintos continentes y que dicen que al menos un país europeo ha visto uno de ellos.
First of all, with regard to the balloon, we will have more to say about that in the days ahead. We are getting more information almost by the hour as we continue to work to salvage the balloon. We're learning from that, and as well, we're learning from what we saw and picked up as the balloon traversed the United States. As to who's responsible for that, China is. And it doesn't matter on one level, which individuals may or may not have been responsible. The fact is, China engaged in this irresponsible action, a violation of our sovereignty and territorial integrity and international law. And as we've noted as well, we're not alone in this. Countries across 5 continents have also had surveillance balloons overfly their territory, which is why we're sharing this information with others. We continue to look to China to act responsibly and as well to help us in managing this relationship responsibly. That's what we continue.
Que se dice el pecado, pero no el pecador. Que han visto algunos países los globos en distintos continentes, en los 5 continentes, en 5 continentes, pero ¿qué países? No lo sabemos, no nos lo dicen. Al menos un país europeo, etcétera, etcétera. En eso anda Antony Blinken, que en todo caso dice que dará más detalles sobre qué había en ese globo satelital, en ese globo chino, y qué buscaba exactamente en las próximas horas, ha llegado a decir, en horas o días, que se está trabajando precisamente en todo ello. Insisto, que se han visto en todos los continentes, que están seguros de que China es responsable de esto y que están intentando averiguar exactamente el tipo de información que China pretendía recabar con estos globos. Volvemos hasta allí.
And what we did initially, in fact, before the Russian aggression itself, as we saw it coming, and wanted to make sure that Ukraine had in its hands what it would need to defend itself, we did these very significant drawdowns a year, more than a year and a half ago, back in September, before the aggression. Christmas before the aggression, and as a result they had things like Stingers and Javelins on hand when Russia went at Kyiv, and they were able to repel the attack and push it back. At every step along the way, as needs have evolved, so too is what we have provided Ukraine, and that most recently took place with the decision to provide the Abrams tanks, and of course Germany providing the Leopard tanks and other Europeans doing the same. We've also been very clear all along that what's vital is not just a particular weapon system, a piece of equipment. Equally important is the ability of Ukrainians to use it effectively, and that requires, in some cases, significant training. Equally important is the ability to maintain it. And then finally, all of that has to be brought together in a coherent strategy.
Te lo venimos contando en Negocios Televisión desde que se anunció la decisión de enviar Leopards por parte de Alemania y distintos países de Europa y de enviar esos Abrams por parte de los americanos a Ucrania. Esto que acaba de decir Antony Blinken era de cajón de madera. No, igual de importante que enviar el armamento es entrenar, y además ha dicho que es un entrenamiento significativamente importante, a quienes lo van a pilotar y sobre todo darle después salida a solución y suficiente capacidad para mantener todo ese material, porque evidentemente si no, acabará también destrozado. Así que en ese sentido hay que darle material para los tanques, para los aviones, para cualquier cosa que se va a enviar, y entrenamiento, lo cual va a llevar, ha dicho, varios meses. Jens Stoltenberg toma la palabra ahora en Washington.
They use satellites, they use cyber, and as we've seen over the United States, also balloons. So we just have to be vigilant. We need to be aware of the constant risk of Chinese intelligence, and then step up what we do to protect ourselves. And we need also to react in a prudent, responsible and vigilant way, as we have seen the United States has reacted to this specific balloon over North America, the United States. I think it also highlights that security is not regional, security is global. What happens in Asia matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Asia, and also, of course, for North America. This was a message that was very much confirmed during my visit to Japan and South Korea, East Asia last week, where those close partners of NATO very much highlighted the importance of strengthening the cooperation between NATO and our partners in the Indo-Pacific to address the challenges that China poses to our security, to our values, and to our interests. And I think that the balloon over North America just confirms that pattern.
We'll take a final question from Karen Erickson of Indy.
Ojo a esta afirmación. Es importante que sigamos manteniendo con la gente del Índico, del Pacífico, con ese Indio-Pacífico, que sigamos manteniendo con nuestros aliados una relación de seguridad y además de forma habitual, es importante que sigamos comunicándonos, que sigamos impulsándonos unos a otros, porque dice Jens Stoltenberg que China está cuestionando la seguridad y los valores que se dan en esos países de la OTAN y en esa relación con esos países que suponemos, como nos ha mencionado antes, serán Japón o Corea del Sur, y que la prueba de que China se está cuestionando todo esto son precisamente esos globos sobre Estados Unidos, particularmente. Importante esa afirmación del señor Stoltenberg, atribuyendo directamente la presencia de esos globos al hecho de que China se esté cuestionando cuál es la seguridad real de los países de la OTAN y sus aliados en el Pacífico.
The quickest in NATO's modern history, because we have to remember that Finland and Sweden applied in May last year, and only in July they were invited, and now 28 out of 30 have ratified the protocols. They applied together, they were invited together, and 28 allies have already signed both protocols. I think it's important that we recognize the importance both for Finland and Sweden, but also for the whole alliance, that they become a member, that they will become members as quickly as possible. As part of the decision in Madrid, Finland, Sweden, and Turkey signed a joint memorandum on how to step up cooperation, not least in the fight against terrorism. Finland and Sweden have delivered on their commitments under that memorandum. I also expressed that view in my meetings with the Turkish leadership. So I'm confident that both will become a member, but I'm not ready to go into exactly when that will happen.
What he said.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.